My guest today is Beth Clare McManus, coaching psychologist and illustrator from Manchester in the UK. As well as being an EMCC accredited coach and mentor at senior practitioner level, Beth also holds an MSc in positive psychology and coaching psychology and has recently completed stage 1 of the Oxford Brookes Advanced Study in Coaching Supervision Certificate, adding coaching supervision to her offer. So it's amazing we've got any time with Beth today, given all of that stuff you've been doing. Beth has also done some genuinely fascinating research on the use of music and mark making, which I'm going to link to in the show notes, so you can access that. And also co-leads on the Coaching Psychology EMCC Special Interest Group. I'll also put a link for that there as well if you're interested. But I think it's fair to say, Beth, isn't it, that we both have a shared passion for creative coaching? We've collaborated on those sorts of things in the past. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you here as a guest on the podcast. So welcome, Beth.
Hi, thanks, Stephen. And yeah, absolutely delightful to spend this time with you talking about myself and coaching psychology today. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, we're very grateful of your time, as I say. What I wanted to explore with you is, whilst we've got you here, is the world of coaching psychology. It's something that I'm learning more about, and I think it's a fascinating area, so it would be great to pick your brains on that, but also where this discipline also combines with your creative coaching self and creative coaching approach. So that would be what we'd like to cover off, if that's okay. In a twist of fate, the book Introduction to Coaching Psychology landed on my desk today, just before we're recording this podcast. And just whilst I was thumbing through the first couple of chapters, I found a really interesting sort of definition. Definitions of coaching are notoriously difficult, and I don't think it's any different with coaching psychology, but I really like the fact that it says in the very early chapter of the book, whilst coaching and coaching psychology maintain distinctions, their paths are aligned, walking together rather than divergently. Nice visual metaphor there. Each learns from and is informed by the other. So, yeah, I guess an opening question then, what is coaching psychology, Beth, and how does it differ from other coaching?
Yeah, I think that's such a lovely image, isn't it, of the two walking together. Maybe not quite hand in hand. They might be at certain times, but yeah, definitely that sense of commonality. I don't think I'm alone in this view, but I also know that, you know, other perspectives are out there of what's the difference, kind of what do we mean by coaching psychology and how is it different. But for me, all coaching is psychological. Okay, so we're interested in people's brains, what they think, we're interested in their bodies and how they feel, and kind of emotions and how they're showing up. So we're interested in the person, in the human. So the psychology is always there. I think the distinction for me of working as a coaching psychologist is about the application of psychology to my practice. How that manifests for me is, you know, I am a psychologist. So in any context, whether it's coaching or otherwise, that will remain true. So the lens with which I view my client and their thoughts and the things that they share with me is through several different lenses, including creativity, which you alluded to, but that kind of psychological lens of, you know, what's happening for this person right now, what's going on in their brain, what's happening in their body, what does this tell me, or what can I infer from this? Which probably to most listeners sounds exactly like coaching, because to me, like, and to use that analogy from the book, they are very similar. You know, there are distinctions, but for me, it's that applied nature. So that deliberate, intentional psychological lens that you bring as a practitioner. In my work, it's not showing up in that space as specific tools or things that I might bring to work with. It's very much about me, and the curiosity and the questions that I might have are informed by my psychological knowledge and experience. So yeah, it's the practitioner rather than the practice, I think.
Interesting.
But I'm sure other people will have, you know, a different slant on that.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is, again, not to draw back to definitions and stuff, but on the surface they can feel quite similar. There's another quote in that book from the British Psychological Society, which is, coaching psychology is about enhancing well-being, performance in personal life and work. So I guess that really makes sense that it's from the position of the practitioner. For those not informed on such things, what does that involve? If we wanted to become a coach and psychologist, how does the training and and learning that discipline differ from an executive coach, for example?
Well, that's a great question, Stephen, because it's still a little bit in development. So the British Psychological Society, if you've never come across it before, has several different divisions. It has, for example, division of clinical psychology, division of educational psychology, of occupational psychology, which is my background. Yeah. And very recently, the most recent division that's been formed is the division of coaching psychology. So up till last year, that was a special group in coaching psychology. So that the interest has been there, but actually making it a full division means that chartership as a coaching psychologist is now possible. Now, in order to become a member of the British Psychological Society, which is kind of step one towards that coaching psychologist qualification, you have to do an accredited psychology degree or conversion course. And the reason for that is that they really want to see a breadth of psychological understanding and knowledge, not just the depth in your specific area. So for me to join the division of occupational psychology, which is my kind of route in, I did a psychology and HR management undergrad degree that was accredited, and I had to learn about all sorts of different bits of psychology, like the kind of history of it, bits of neuroscience, bits of social psychology. So you really have to demonstrate a breadth. And then once you're a member, so you get what's called graduate basis for chartership, or graduate basis for membership, maybe it's recently changed, sorry if that's wrong. You can then go on to do in other divisions, it's called a stage 2. So that's kind of stage 1 is getting to their stage 2 equivalent. So at the moment, there is an accelerated route, and then there will be a portfolio route where you have to demonstrate the competencies of a coaching psychologist, which have been devised. They're kind of level 8, so kind of PhD or doctorate equivalent level qualification. And you build a portfolio of evidence, which includes working with a supervisor who is a chartered psychologist on your coaching practice, and you either have to do a research study or a case study, and there's a big portfolio that you kind of build, and that's then assessed, and then you pay the money and get the stamp. To say, that feels a bit flippant, because actually it is a massive achievement. Absolutely. Essentially, that's kind of the process. So it's quite long, and there's a few different stages.
Yeah, so it's pretty robust. And I guess there's different, even if we just look at coaching as a discipline, the differences in training and education that is involved in coaching alone, is massively different from year-long courses to a 2-day course, which proposes to be, turn you out as a professional coach at the end of it. So it sounds like this is a really robust process, which is fantastic. I want to come back to the grounding in psychology thing, because this is one of the biggest boundaries that, when you're going through your coach training, whatever it might be, comes up. So I want to come back to that, if that's okay. But just before we do that, what are the benefits then? If I'm a client of yours or a coaching psychologist, what would you say are the key benefits of being coached by yourself in that way, I should say?
Yeah, I'll speak about my own practice. The word that's coming up really strongly when you ask that question is about safety, because I think that having an understanding of what might happen, I'm trying to think of a way of phrasing this that doesn't make people feel that they are unsafe practitioners if they're not bringing that kind of psychological lens, because that isn't what I believe or mean by this. But something about, you alluded to it there about the kind of boundaries. I think that the acute awareness you have as a psychologist of the harm that is possible is just an enhanced version of where most coaches start off. And I think that it's almost, I used the word accelerate before, I think, but it is almost like an accelerated version where I think non-psychologists who are coaching probably learn from experience, and they might have a few bad experiences or, you know, go to group supervision and hear about other people's. Yeah. I think as a psychologist, it's not that you're immune to things going wrong or things happening where you're actually feeling like you're out of your depth. But that acute awareness of the risk that is possible when we dig in people's brains means that you are kind of probably just coming from a slightly different angle. Yeah. And also, I think personally, I did, you mentioned in the intro, I did a supervision or part one of a supervision course at Oxford Brookes recently. There was a couple, me and one other, or a couple of other psychologists or people who had a psychological background. And I would say that the difference there was not always huge, but it was palpable to me who was coming at it with that lens of care and harm and risk. Yeah. And who was maybe butting up against that boundary a little bit more harshly. Still aware of it, still operating within it, but maybe sort of testing it a bit harder. And not approaching it almost like, you know, approaching it at 5 miles an hour, really slowly and gently with your foot over the brake, versus sort of careering into it and hoping that the boundary holds.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and useful definition of it, actually. Because I mean, let's just jump to where I was going to talk about before, because I think my experience as somebody who works with a lot of people who are new to coaching, you know, and takes them on that development journey from never having done it to being a professional coach at the end of it. One of the major concerns is that boundary of when does this morph into counselling, or how much digging around in people's brain is too much. And because they don't, and me included, don't have that psychological grounding, it probably takes a lot of experience of butting up against that boundary to understand, and then suddenly it can be a bit of a red flag, or I must hand it off here, or whatever. But what I'm hearing is, because of your grounding, it can be managed a lot, well, I'll use your word, safely. I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, that there's more knowledge behind to understand the pitfalls, I suppose, of crossing that boundary, or even when that boundary is approaching, that type of thing. Do you think in that sense then, because we have these, you know, coaching versus training, coaching versus therapy, you know, all those things that we're managing, does coaching psychology bridge that gap somewhat between coaching and therapy? Because everything in the world of coaching really takes its inspiration from the advances in neuroscience and psychological developments anyway. So does coaching psychology bridge that gap, do you think?
I'm very cautiously going to say I think it can. And the reason for my caution is anyone who has ever worked with me, either as a client or as a supervisor, will know that I am like possibly slightly too rigid sometimes around like boundaries, process, contracting. Like I really like everything to be, and that safety word is a big driver for this, but I like everything to be kind of set up just so, and whatever. And I'm very, very firm with my boundaries between, you know, where things are maybe getting into therapeutic. So, you know, as an example, if I was having a conversation with a client and it brought up for them, I'm sat at my kitchen table as a child and I can hear my dad saying this thing to me, and I've realised that's a story that I tell about myself, I'm not going to immediately shut the conversation down and say, you need some therapy, because actually I'm not qualified to make that judgment. But what I am going to do is get curious about, well, what does that tell you in the here and now? And kind of how does that relate to your current stuckness or problem, or the thing that we're coaching in? But I am also going to highlight that feels like something that you might want to explore in a different space. Whereas other coaching psychologists, and some of them come from a therapeutic, you know, they'll be clinical psychologists or counsellors, and move across and train or retrain or add to their training, however they want to kind of experience that as coaches. I'm sure that there are people who work much closer and maybe slightly across those boundaries because that's their background, experience, expertise, training. Yeah. For me, it's a very hard line because I'm a coach. I am a psychologist, but I'm an occupational psychologist. So I'm interested in the science of people at work.
Yeah.
That doesn't give me that kind of comfort. And actually, I quite like holding on to the feeling of discomfort because it usually tells me I'm straying somewhere that I am not qualified to be. But I think other people might have a different take on that. And in fact, I know they do because they come the other way. So actually, and it does raise some interesting ethical questions, which we probably don't have time to fully dive into, but around, is it acceptable to contract with someone that sometimes you'll coach them and sometimes you'll work in a more counselling space, as long as you declare it? I personally wouldn't touch that. It's not for me to say that that's wrong for someone else or their client to work in that way.
Yeah, no, I would tend to agree with you. Again, that's not to say that's the gospel, but it is interesting. That's something that there is a trend now, isn't there, of people working in that clinical space who are porting their roles over to coaches as well. But for me, I think even though there may be an enhanced awareness of the boundary and an enhanced way of dealing with the boundary, maybe it should still be flagged and discussed and another course of action taken, whether that ends up being with the same person and with you. I think it's very important to have defined lines, even if they are crossed eventually, that the client is aware that it's different. Because there's a different ask, isn't there? There's a different ask of the client in coaching compared to therapy.
Yeah, but I think there's also a different ask of the practitioner. Because
absolutely, yeah.
For me, coaching works really well. I'm really non-directive as a coach. So coaching is only really going to work when I'm working with someone who might not be completely capable to start with, but who is willing to do the work themselves and to do that deep, difficult reflection.
Yeah.
And I am also acutely aware that I am trying not to build any level of dependency on me.
Yeah.
Might be supporting a mild dependency on reflective practice, and I think that should be available on prescription for people because I think it can really help. But and coaching is a way of, again, I need to get a better thesaurus, but I'm using accelerating again. It's accelerating that ability to reflect. Like doing it with someone else kind of helps build that muscle. Whereas I think that you also don't want to build dependency in a therapeutic or a counselling space, but there actually is a bit of dependency to start with. That person needs you as a qualified professional in that field to support them. Whereas coaching, I don't ever want to feel like someone feels like they need, and it's going to cause them harm if the coaching can't take place, or I can't work with them anymore or whatever.
Yeah, again, that's a really interesting, of all the different ways we can describe the differences between therapy and coaching, which again, I know from, working with a lot of new coaches, they struggle with initially. One can be dependent, and one, and I agree with you, in my opinion, coaching should be completely non-dependent, non-directive. So yeah, that's really interesting. I've jumped about a bit here, but I kind of just want to go back to when we were defining it and just, do coaching psychologists attract different clients to coaches? And if so, what differentiates a client for yourself, Beth, compared to another coach out there who isn't a coaching psychologist?
It's a great question because, again, I'm sure there'll be other coaching psychologists listening to this thinking like that's not my experience at all.
Yeah.
But for me, people that very rarely know what coaching is, so trying to add in a layer of psychology on there sometimes just isn't worth it because it kind of confuses people even more.
Very true.
It does seem to matter, and not universally, but since I've started offering supervision, I have some amazing coaches that I'm working with in that space, and for some of them, having that psychologically informed practice is important because they also have that psychologically informed practice and therefore want to feel, a function of supervision is really about that reassurance and safety as a practitioner. So it's showing up there. Actually, as more important than any client I've ever worked with. And that makes sense to me, that it would be more important if it's important to you that you want to be supported by someone who also comes from that. But yeah, it's a funny one, because I'm not shy about saying, you know, I'm a coaching psychologist, I have that psychologically informed practice, but most of the conversations that I have with clients are just about coaching and what coaching is. And I'll talk to me as psychologist, going back to that original thing of it's the practitioner, not the practice for me. So I will make sense of it with people, but actually I'm trying not to, like, coaching is already bamboozling people sometimes about like, what am I doing in this phase? You're going to give me the answers, aren't you? And you're like, oh no. So they're all feeling a bit like, not really sure what I've signed up to. So yeah, it's in my experience, it hasn't prevented me or helped me to work with any particular clients. But the supervision of coaches, it's definitely not universally, but it is important for some of the people that I'm working with in that space.
That makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense, because I mean, you've used the word safety. I'm going to put another one out there, particularly in the context of supervision: credibility. Yeah. And again, it's not to say that somebody without coaching psychology isn't credible. That's not what we mean by that. But when you look for a supervisor, you are looking for somebody often who is experienced, knowledgeable. And I think all of that is wrapped up in, is this person a credible professional that, you know, can offer the sort of level of counsel and support that a supervisor does. So that's a really interesting one, actually. As far as being a coaching psychology practitioner is concerned, then, Beth, is there room for other coaching philosophies in your practice? There's the obvious main one. I mean, I want to talk about creativity in a minute, because you know how much I love that anyway, and I want our audience to hear a little bit about that. But apart from creative endeavors, the sort of things that we're all taught on, you know, our coaching programs, like Gestalt and Coactive and solutions focused, even Grow, for example, is there room for all of that as a coach and psychologist?
Yeah, I think so. I think, you know, there are some practitioners who I feel slightly jealous of, actually, who have a real sense of, you know, I am a coactive coach, or I'm a Gestalt practitioner, and I don't feel yet strongly enough about any one approach to sort of marry myself to it. And it's a very timely question, because stage 2 of Oxford Brookes supervision course, which I definitely will do at some point, but I've kind of put a pin in it. Stage 2 and 3 require you to have some supervision with Peter Jackson or Tatiana Bakarova, and then basically write an essay that describes your philosophy, and almost in a very, this is reducing what is obviously a brilliant and very well thought through piece of academically rigorous work. But you have to pick, right? You have to kind of choose what is your philosophy, and my temptation, and I'm sure this is shared by others as well, is just to be like, well, I'll have a little bit of that and a little bit of that and a bit of that, and I do a bit of that, and that's fine. But the reality of that is it's not fine, because, you know, part of one philosophy might directly contradict another philosophy that you're also borrowing bits from, and that is okay in itself, but you have to be able to kind of reconcile that and critically understand what's happening there. So in answer to your question of like, is there room? Absolutely. But as a bit of personal development I'm doing at the moment is really interrogating what is it that I stand for and believe, because it's really nice having the whole pick and mix counter of things that I can borrow. But I think for me, my next piece is, well, which of those are approaches that I might borrow from time to time in a specific scenario or with a specific client, because I think that they might respond well to that way of framing or that way of working. A bit like working with creativity, you know, it's not well, I haven't said this, but I'll probably come on to this. It isn't well, we always work creatively no matter what, and you're just doing it regardless of whether it's right for your situation or you. It's a bit of that, I think. So I definitely think there's room, but as part of my own growth and kind of that thinking that I'm trying to make a bit of space for at the moment is, well, but it's fine. Like coaching and coaching psychologists they are quite specific in some ways, but they're not. So like there's work for me to do around what is it that I actually stand for. And it's actually making me feel a little bit uneasy even saying this out loud, but like, could I get to a point where I'm saying that this is the underpinning of my practice? Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I hope so. But also, do I think that I'll necessarily stay there forever? No. I think the way I had to write about my coaching philosophy during my master's, and I remember that the exact sentence I started with was, my philosophy as a coaching psychologist is evolving, as a complete cop-out, feeling like I wanted to be pinned down.
First line as well. I love it.
Yeah. So I think I might get there, but then I'll probably test that. But I think you should always be questioning, what do I think and believe, and is that still true? And, having had more learning or more experiences or experienced some conflict internally or externally with that philosophy, what does that mean? I think we should continue to question and not just think, well, I'm a solutions focused coach, that's what I do forever. And also, as you can tell, I'm quite careful about not trying to make anyone feel like they've made bad choices, or there's not judgment in that. I just think from my perspective, I wouldn't want to just wed myself to one way of being or doing coaching forever.
Well, if it gives you any level of comfort, you could have just described my entire coaching practice in the last couple of minutes, because I'm exactly the same as you. I find that question really difficult to answer still, even after 8 or 9 years or whatever it is now of coaching, as to what type of coach, what's your philosophy. And ironically, probably getting closer than I ever have with the emergence of creativity in my own practice. That's the thing that's starting to give me more focus, which is still, that's a bit of an easy thing to say as well, because it's still a mishmash and selection of different things. But yeah, I feel like I'm in exactly the same position as what you've just described. Speaking of which, creativity. It would be great to just explore that a little bit and see where that intersects with what we've been talking about as well, because as I said in the intro, you've written some really fascinating stuff on the topic and the use of music and mark making, and obviously you've got this talent of being an illustrator. Just have a look at Beth's website and you'll see what I mean by that. So yeah, creative coaching, how does this manifest itself for you as a coach and psychologist, your creative practice?
Yeah, so again, I think that because someone is probably listening to this and screaming to me that there is a school of psychological thought that completely perfectly encapsulates and underpins what I'm saying about the creativity is me as a practitioner. It's not the tool. It can be, but it isn't just the tool that I'm using or the thing that I'm asking a client to do. It's about me, and that's one of the lenses. Got a sense of wearing, like when you get your eyes tested at the opticians and they put those mad glasses on you, and I've got a sense of like I need one of those as like a physical thing of like, I'm going to put my creativity lens in and then my psychological lens. Anyway, where I think that the psychology helps is, again, there's definitely a safety element that's really present for me at the moment, and I'm aware I might be coming across as a bit of a buzzkill. But I'm actually writing at the moment a short guide to working ethically with creativity for the Association for Coaching as part of a festival of creativity that they're planning for 2024. And I do think that it's partly who I am as a person. Like, I like process, I like rules, I like boundaries. We've talked about, I'm a bit wedded to my contract and I really like to have everything kind of in place. But I think it also, that psychological lens helps here, because that awareness of harm is strong. So when you're working with someone using creativity, and again, disclaimer, this is in no way designed to make anyone feel that this is not for them or they shouldn't do it, but my lovely research supervisor, Andrea Giraldez-Hayes, said at an event I was talking about my research, your clients are not experiments. And I think that encapsulates it for me. Like, it's fine to experiment with different methodologies, but your client in front of you is not an experiment. And if you were, when I did my research, I had to pass an ethical approval process with an ethics board, and there was clear, things in place in case the conversation was derailed from using music and kind of mark making, including debriefs with me and other resources that were available. So there's just a piece about the psychological element. You can probably tell I haven't 100% processed this thinking, but it's getting there, around using creativity. So music is one that feels like it's an easy one to use as an example. You could start in the coaching space side by side with your client. You could play a piece of music and you could inadvertently shoot them off to a different space because that music has significant personal meaning for them that you didn't know about, or actually you've chosen to ask them to bring something personally significant and not really thought about that they might pick something that's about a difficult topic. Or music does make our it lights our brain up. It gets us thinking about things in a different way. It gets us feeling things. It's why music's so amazing. But there's a danger if your client shoots off to somewhere and you are either not confident or not experienced enough to get there with them. They're off doing something that you're no longer in control of the session. And there's a real skill in knowing when to say to someone, right, I think we need to stop this, because actually they might be having a great reflection and doing some brilliant work. But for me, if you feel ever so slightly out of control, that's not a great space to be in as a coach. So the psychological piece for me, where it's most strongly showing up with the creativity piece, is again just that acute understanding of the potential, sure, for creativity, but also the risk. That art and creativity are used in therapy for a reason. It connects us to our subconscious, it connects us to our feelings, which is super helpful for coaching and amazing when it is maintained within its boundaries and when the coach is in control of the space. But where it's got the risk is, I think, some of the conversations that I have or listen to with other people talking about using creativity in their coaching, it's that angle that feels the most different for me. And I can't tell you how much of that is me as a person and how much of that is the psychological lens, because they're kind of intrinsically mashed together now. But I do think that that's a slight different perspective that I might bring from having that psychological background.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And again, some great, because there is a growing network of people in our profession who are really interested in creativity. Why wouldn't you be? It's like exciting, isn't it? It can often, and especially in the case of, I know for you and for me, connect you with a passion as well. And if you can bring that to your coaching, like, wow, what an experience. But it's really wise counsel around, there are some, it has to be maintained, it has to be controlled, it has to be done with invitation, and to put it really bluntly, done properly and effectively, hasn't it? So that's really interesting. What just for those listening, what other sort of creative things do you bring to a coaching session then, Beth? When inviting people to be creative, what tools in your toolkit do you bring out on occasion?
It's an interesting one because I think there's a range of things, so I can list a few things off, but then there is a bit of a reflection here as well. So I've done coaching with people while they are painting, doing sort of abstract painting work. Done lots of things with people drawing, either sort of doodling or drawing specific rather than using language, kind of trying to capture an essence of something in an image. Music. I've had someone doing some macrame just as a kind of keeping hands busy. I have had some coaching where I did some sewing, just some random bits of sewing in a piece of cotton, and really found that it was while I was doing my master's, it was a coach that I'd never worked with before, and I was really disclosing some quite personal stuff really quickly because I was mildly distracted enough from doing the sewing that I sort of just felt like it was really good at. it did accelerate that whole trust process and kind of sharing. So there's all sorts of things. We've had to play around making some music, although I just did a drum beat and sort of didn't really follow the brief. Doesn't sound like me at all. But yeah, so there's all sorts of things that I've played with. But the thing that I was going to reflect is, I was having a conversation last week with Maxine Bell, who we both know from doing podcasts with the Association for Coaching, about how increasingly over the last sort of 18 months or so, illustration, which is my main creative outlet, I'm feeling really massively protective of it, and I'm not offering it out in my coaching. It originated as my reflective practice, and it has returned very firmly to being an important part of my practice. And I don't think that's a permanent shift. But Maxine was reflected, and I'm sure she won't mind me sharing, but like poetry is kind of her medium, but actually that's very personal to her and isn't necessarily something that comes out. And it was just interesting to think about that. It feels like if you've got a creative outlet, that can be the obvious thing to bring into the coaching space and experiment with. But two things. One is, I think we have to build our relationship with that creative outlet first as a practitioner, which is often by default because it's our creative practice. But then I think there is a second piece about sometimes that does overcomplicate it, because you know how it should be done, or you kind of know what the right thing is, or my illustration started as me drawing things from my everyday life and then writing my reflections around it. Now, I described that process to someone else. It's very simple. Doesn't belong to me, but I know I would find it really hard if they interpreted it in a different way. And I was just like, well, that might be helpful for you, but it's not what you were asked to do, is it? It's like I'm too close to it, so I'm that I can kind of use it for what it clearly is showing up for me as something that I need to work with as part of my development and reflection. I'm hoping I can bring it back into exploration with other people, but I think there's an ebb and flow with it, and it's an interesting piece about, it feels like the obvious thing is if you're a painter, we'll paint with people. I would exercise caution and maybe try something neutral that you don't have any strong attachment to it being good or right or understood or whatever, because everyone's going to do it differently, and you just have to embrace that.
How interesting. Yeah, how interesting that's for you, and by the sounds of Maxine as well, that it's become something you're protective over. That's really interesting, because as you know, the music thing, which we haven't discussed a lot on this podcast, actually, maybe for a future episode, is my passion project and interest, and I can totally get that. Although I'm probably not at that stage yet, I can totally get that. Interesting. I could talk to you all day, by the way, Beth, and this could be about a 3-hour podcast. But I guess just to kind of, because I'm sure this conversation has sparked lots of interest and reflections for people listening. How could people find out more information about the work that you do, Beth, and about coaching psychology, perhaps the EMCC, special interest group, that type of thing?
Yeah, so the best place to connect with me on is LinkedIn, because that's the place that I post things. I do have an Instagram. I can give you the links to these as well to share.
Yeah, we'll put them in the show notes, yeah.
Perfect. I do have an Instagram which hasn't got anything on it. I've had a cull of absolutely all my content.
Really?
Not because I want to be like super controlling and curating it. Just it didn't feel like it spoke to where I am as a professional. Like it kind of, it just didn't, the synergy's not there. But I'm starting a PhD in September, investigating the role of creativity, and I'm hoping to use Instagram as part of my sort of almost data, like my processing. So I will be sharing there, but it's empty at the moment. So you can follow me, but there's nothing on there. And then, the EMCC, I can give you a link to the Coaching Psychology Special Interest Group page. There's an email address where you can contact myself or Sally and Kaz, who are the other two co-leads. But essentially, we just try and run an event on the first Monday of each month, with a few exceptions. We didn't have one when there was bank holiday. But yeah, we try and run at least one session. And I think we're fully booked for 2024, so we've got lots of sessions already up on the website and some others to come. But yeah, basically just keep an eye on the events page, and they'll always be kind of branded as Coaching Psychology Special Interest Group, and they're free for members, and you can come to 3 sessions free if you're not an EMCC member. So hopefully there should be some way of making that accessible for people who are interested.
Brilliant. And I can personally vouch, having come to that. I think I came to the first one, and that was a brilliant hour spent. Very creative and really useful. So anybody listening, especially seeing as if you're even not a member, you can get along for free for the first 3. Why not? But yeah, I'll put all the links in the description that the Beth talked about, so you can find them and find out more information. Beth, it's been fantastic to have your time. Very grateful. So thank you very much for being a guest on the podcast, and we'll speak to you again soon, hopefully.
No problem. Thank you so much, Stephen.